hit the power button on your computer, what we've talked about before is there's a CMOS battery that's powering a ROM chip, or your CMOS ROM chip. What's one of the big things on that ROM chip? Is your BIOS, is your UEFI, right? BIOS, UEFI, what's one big thing it's going to do to boot up the computer? The first thing. POST, which stands for Power On Self-Test, right? That's our hardware check, make sure everything is good, right? If there's any errors during that process, what's going to happen? Beep codes, very good. Now let's say we don't have an internal microphone or speaker on our computer and our display is not working. What's something we could use to make sure that we can get those errors? Goes in an expansion slot. It's our postcard. Remember that has that LCD display? So we'll turn off our computer, put that postcard in there, boot up our computer, and if there's any errors, it'll show up on that LCD screen on that postcard that goes in the expansion slot. Then you can look at the manual that came with it, or use another computer and Google what that error means. Easy day? Okay, so going back, let's say POST is successful. It's got all the hardware. What happens next? Well, then BIOS is going to locate, and it's going to read the configuration settings that are stored in the ROM chip in CMOS. So it reads those configuration settings. It boots the computer using the first drive that has a valid boot sector. Remember how we talked about hard drives can be really large, right? So instead of searching everything, it's going to look for the valid boot sector. When it finds that boot sector, that's going to have the MBR, the master boot record that we talked about earlier. That MBR identifies which volume boot record, or VBR, has the boot manager, because you may have multiple operating systems on there. So the boot manager, what do managers do? Well, they manage. What's it managing? Well, the boot, the turning on of the computer, right? So it's got to find that boot manager, so that way that software that's in charge of the boot process can do its thing. Easy day? Awesome. So then once it's located, control of the boot process is going to be given to the boot manager. And again, this is an executable file, so bootmanager.exe. So the boot manager, after BIOS, that's who's in charge, or what's in charge. Easy day? Now, another program, winload.exe, executable, that's going to use the path that the boot manager specifies to find which partition to boot from. So boot manager has a path. It's going to give that path to winload to find the partition to boot from. Good? It's going to load two core files of Windows, the NTOS kernel and the HAL, which is the hardware abstraction layer. Now this is the very, very simplified boot process for Windows, so we're not going to go too deep into it, but you've got the two core main parts of Windows. You've got the NTOS kernel, and you've got the HAL. So let's start with the HAL. That's the hardware abstraction layer. So think about all the hardware you have in your computer, the motherboard, the RAM, the storage, etc., right? There's got to be something in between that hardware and that software so it can communicate, right? Kind of think of different planes, right? So that HAL, that hardware abstraction layer, that's that control plane between our hardware and the software. So that's what the HAL, the hardware abstraction layer, is in charge of. Good? That makes sense, everybody? NTOS kernel, right? That's the kernel of the operating system. That's really the software portion. Easy day? So winload.exe is doing the NTOS kernel and the HAL. HAL is a .dll, dynamic link library, that we'll talk about more in chapter 11. Then it's going to read the registry. That's something else we're going to talk more about in chapter 11. It's going to choose a different hardware profile, or the appropriate hardware profile, and then it loads the device drivers. What's a driver? Translator. A translator for what? For hardware. Each piece of hardware has a driver, right? So post, right, way before in this process, make sure that we've got enough hardware. But now we're loading the drivers for all of our hardware in the boot process. Because in order to use our computer, all those drivers have to be loaded so we can use that hardware. Good to go? All right, the NTOS kernel is then going to start WinLogon, Windows Logon, another executable. So the NTOS kernel takes control, and then it's going to start WinLogon to start that logon process. When the WinLogon executable is loaded, it's going to execute that logon process, and then finally, it's going to give you that welcome screen where you can enter your credentials and log in. So after this entire process is done, that's when you're presented with that screen where then you can log into the computer. After this entire process happens, that's when Windows has booted successfully. And it's going to create a file called the last known good configuration. So you didn't log in yet, but Windows booted successfully, right? So that's when that's going to be created. Does that kind of make sense to everyone? Okay. All right, we can go back to the slides. And that's what all of this paragraph here is saying. Anyone need more time? Does that help a little bit from what we wrote down earlier? Okay. Startup modes. So there's something called BSOD. Does anyone know what that stands for? Petty Officer? Yeah. Blue screen of death. That's where, you boot up and it's got a blue screen, errors. I can't get into my computer. There's some error going on. So you've got different startup modes that are going to help you troubleshoot your computer. Now, you may want to get into this all on your own. So during the post process, you can hit F8 to get into the different startup modes. Now, for Windows 7, these are all going to be something to do with safe mode. What is safe mode? Well, remember in our boot process, when device drivers were loaded, typically it's going to load all of the device drivers you have on your computer. What safe mode will do will only load the drivers that are required for basic functionality, and nothing else is loaded. Because a lot of the issues in the computers, they come from these drivers. So it's going to just turn on the very essential drivers that you need so you can start troubleshooting. So that's safe mode. Now, when you get into safe mode, you're not going to, then turn back on all the drivers because you haven't eliminated which driver it is that's causing the problem. So one at a time, you turn on the drivers until the problem occurs, then you know exactly which driver is the problem. Roll back that driver, upgrade it to a more recent driver, whatever you need to do to fix that driver, fix that problem. If it's not a driver issue, then you can continue troubleshooting other things.
So basically only turns on drivers needed to figure out what's wrong?
Correct. You got enough drivers so you can get into the computer and do basic stuff. So you can start your troubleshooting process. And of course, you remember the steps of the troubleshooting process. What's the mnemonic we use? I eat tacos every 5 days. All right, so safe mode. That's what safe mode is. Does safe mode make sense to everyone? The next one is safe mode with networking. What's the difference? Well, it loads the driver for your NIC so you can connect to the internet, so you can connect to a network. Because maybe you need to use that computer to Google and get on some forums or read some manuals, etc., so you can figure out what's going on. Safe mode with command prompt is safe mode, but it has support for command line interface instead of your graphical user interface. Maybe you've got an issue with your display, so you can just do basic command line interface display. It's less resource intensive on your computer. Hooyah? You could also boot up from the last known good configuration. Remember that boot process that we just went over? When you're presented with that welcome logon screen? Well, the last time that was successful, it'll update that last known good configuration file, and it'll boot up to that. Not when you log in, but when you're presented with that logon screen, with that Windows splash screen. Now, last known good configuration, right? You could still have an issue. It's just, when you're presented with that splash screen, doesn't mean that that issue isn't present. Do we need a second to write down? Okay. Anyone have any questions while people are still writing? Remember, these are just for Windows 7. What's that? I don't do lyrics. No lyrics. Well, you were able to get through here, right? Are there people over there, Abdul? Are there workers over there?
No, they're closed right now.
Oh, okay, yeah, that door. We need more time? All right, let's move on. Windows 10 startup modes. Well, it's going to have all, and Windows 8 and Windows 10. It's going to have all the same modes that Windows 7 did with safe mode. It only loads those essential drivers. Safe mode with networking and safe mode with command prompt. It's also going to have some other options as well. You've got debugging, which is going to log and record all of the errors during the boot process so you can deep dive into the troubleshooting and figure out what exactly is causing the issue that you're having. Low resolution video, so you can use your built-in graphics on your motherboard to not use your independent graphics card. You can disable automatic restart after failure. Now, a common issue you're probably going to have is your computer boots, fails, restarts. Fail, restart, and you can't do anything because it's constantly rebooting. So to prevent that, so you can get in and do some troubleshooting, you can disable that automatic restart so you can try to get some troubleshooting done on that computer. You've also got disabled driver signature enforcement. So we know drivers, that's a translator for each piece of hardware. And those drivers, some of them have a signature on them to say from like Windows, from Mac, etc., that says, hey, yeah, the vendor of this operating system, we trust this driver. It works, there's no issues, it's not malware, etc. Use that driver. So you can disable that so you can use drivers that aren't signed as well. So driver signature enforcement, you can only use drivers that the vendor says, yes, those are okay, we trust those. Disable that, you can use whichever drivers you have installed. We've got early launch anti-malware protection. So maybe blocking something that it identifies as malware, maybe it's not malware, and it's blocking it and causing the issue. So you can disable that as well. Of course, you want to be careful when you're doing this. So these are for Windows 8 and Windows 10. You get into this the same way for Windows 7. And then you would hit your function keys on the top row of your keyboard, F1 through F9, to select whichever option you'd want. So for example, safe mode would be which function key? F4. Very good. And then we can hit F10, and there's even more options. Imagine we need some time to write this down. Okay. How was PT yesterday? Amazing. It was a lot of work.
I know, Van Kirk did not just say that.
Van Kirk's LOD, aren't you?
Exactly.
All right, we good? All right. I think the next thing we've got is a quiz. Keep going down. All right. What locates and reads the configuration settings that are stored in the CMOS memory ROM chip? BIOS, basic input output setup. What loads the configuration settings that were used the last time that Windows started successfully? Last known good, too easy. What identifies the VBR? What's VBR stand for? Volume boot record. So what identifies the volume boot record, which loads the boot manager? MBR, which stands for master boot record. What's a diagnostic mode used to troubleshoot Windows and Windows startup issues? Safe mode. Opens the Windows Advanced Boot Options menu? F8. What opens the Windows Advanced Boot Options menu? Does that just saying this? Menu used to select the boot device. That's the next thing. Boot device priority. There we go. Slight hiccup on my part. Good. Any questions? Any questions on Chapter 10?